right, we're ready to start sewing. We have all of our prep work done, and I just wanted to go over a couple of things with you. Like I mentioned, I shortened this 10 inches. So essentially, I took the pattern piece down by the skirt, each of the skirt patterns, not the hem. You don't want to do it at the hem because the hem has shape to it. So we want to leave that alone. So I went about 5 inches up and I measured 5 inches and folded it. So that gave me 10 inches that I shortened each of the skirt pattern pieces by. So the dress will be a little shorter instead of floor length because it's just overwhelming with me. And then this is what I have left for fabric. So I never would have been able to make a floor length dress anyway. This makes me happy because I'm not throwing away a ton of stuff. So that is going in the bin. And then I also checked my pieces. So that's one of the things you want to do, especially when you're working with this fabric is so soft and delicate. I checked it on the serger, and the serger, it works perfectly with the serger. And you want to do 2 pieces together just like you would be serging a seam. And then I also worked with the seam allowance to see how that was going to be, and my stitch is about a 2, not about a 2, it is a 2, and then this presses beautifully like that, holds a gorgeous press. So even though it's such a delicate fabric, it's holding up to the iron and the serger and everything. When you're doing something with a fabric like this that's just so soft and beautiful, you want to use really, really sharp, thin needles. So these are 60-8 needles, and these will go through your fabric like butter, right? I also interfaced the back neck, and then I interfaced both of the plackets, and I did a full interfacing on both of them. Gives you the option to do full or half because this fabric is so soft. And it's really important to interface something. See how soft and drapey that is, and then see how this one has some body to it. This is the neck interfacing. That piece around your neck and the piece going down the front, you want to have a little bit of structure. And I like, even though this isn't a stretch, I like using this stretch tricot interfacing. You can find it at a lot of the stores now. More and more are coming, having it in stock, but I also carry it in my Etsy store. It's I use it on everything, unless I'm making a coat, which I need, then you need like something really heavy with some body. I use it on everything. So we've done our samples, everything is interfaced, so we're ready to start sewing. And we're going to start with pieces 1 and 2. So we have the 2 front pieces for the bodice, and we are going to stay stitch this neck edge. And what that is you want to stitch inside the seam allowance. The stay stitching is just there to keep this from stretching out because it is cut a little bit on the bias, and we want to finish it nicely. We don't want it to get all wavy, and if it stretches out of shape, it's going to be miserable. So after we do that, we're going to take piece 2 and we are going to sew the side seams. So we're going to sew these seams, these little seams over here, the 2 little short side seam pieces. We're going to stitch those together, and then it says to serge them and to press them towards the front of the bodice piece. So we're going to go ahead and take care of that. That's the first step, and this dress has a lot of pieces, but I think it's going to go up pretty fast. It's a fairly simple construction, and the instructions are very well written, so you shouldn't have too much trouble following along. So here we go, we're off. All right, our front is put together. We stay stitched this neck edge so it doesn't get out of shape because we're going to be using this and moving it around, and then sewed the little side seams, little tiny side seams here. And now we're going to put the skirt together. So think about this. This is our top piece, right? So we need to attach a skirt all the way around from one side of the front to the other side of the front. So we're going to sew those pieces together. And we have 7 pieces. We have 2 center fronts, 2 side fronts, 1 center back because we cut it on the fold, and 2 side backs. So right now we're going to put together the 2 center fronts. And one of the best things when you're ever confused about something is to look at the drawing. And you can see that this wide piece here, which is the side front, there's no number on it, so that makes it a little confusing. And this narrow front piece are being stitched together. So we want to mimic that with our pattern pieces. So essentially, we're going to sew this piece, piece 3, with this little tail that comes up in the center front, right, to piece 4. And you know that they're going to match up because down here towards the bottom are some double notches. You see the double notches on both pieces there? There's one here, and then on this one, there's one there. So we know that's how those pieces go together. And if we look at the pattern instructions, you can see, whoop, I'm losing them. Don't go away. They're falling. You can see this, how this resembles that, right? We have this larger piece here in the bottom, and then we have this longer piece with this funny little pointy thing that goes up in the front together. So we're going to sew the left one and the right one. We have 2. Now, I've been sewing for about 50 years, and I still lay all my pattern pieces out on the table in front of me and pin them because it's very easy to mix them up. So I'm going to start with the side front pieces. I'm going to open them up and lay them out so the notches, so my notches are down here. When in doubt, check the pattern piece, just relay it on top. Let's see, that top matches up and my notch is here, so I know this is the right way. And then I'm going to take my center front pieces, where'd they get off to? Here we go. And I'm going to lay those right side up again. Right side up. It's the easiest way to make sure that you get it right, with the notches matching here. All right, so my notches are matching, seams are matching. So now I am going to fold this over because this is the seam I want to sew. I'm going to put a pin in here at the top. And I'm also going to put a pin at the bottom. And then I will work my way down the seam, pinning it, whoop, pin it to itself. Let's try that again. There we go. This is why we don't do this in our lap. It's much better if you do it out on the table, because it's very easy with all of these pieces to get confused. So I know those pieces are going to go together, and if I look at them, if I look at that drawing again, just to be sure, this is the reverse of the drawing, right? I have the large piece here and the small piece with this neckline piece going up into it. So I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Put a pin at the top. Put a pin at the bottom. And then I'll take my time and pin everything in between. But this one is a better view. You can see that it looks exactly like the drawing. Slide it down here a little bit. So it looks exactly like the drawing, right? You have this curved wide piece and this neckline. So we know we're on the right track. So these are our 2 center fronts. So we're going to sew these seams, and they want us to serge them and press them towards the center front, so they're going to get pressed this way. All right, and then we'll be back to do the same thing with the 2 back pieces. Boy, I love this fabric. It's just so floaty and soft. So this is the back. We did the same thing with the back as we did with the front. We took the center back, laid it out. This is the top. Put the back, it's actually the left, but one side of the back on one side and one side and the other side on the other side, and stitch them serge them and press the seams towards the middle. So now we're going to just construct this full skirt. So I have the back laid out face up, and again I'm going to do the same thing as I do with all my pattern pieces. I'm going to lay them face up so I know what I'm sewing is the right thing to do. Now we know in this front piece, these are our front pieces, this is the center front, right? This is where that piece comes up in the front. So that's going to go over on this side. And that matches up beautifully. I have to say, even with shortening these seams, the length of this, the pieces match up absolutely spectacular. So, and then this obviously is going to be on this side. So I'm going to pin those, stitch them, serge them, and press them towards the back. And I'm going to have one big long skirt that's going to be attached to my big open top piece that we haven't sewn together yet. Think of it like a coat. It's going to come together like a coat, right? So it's going to open in the front. We're so used to sewing things with zippers in the back that this is a little different, but this is a beautiful shirt dress, floaty, very romantic, ethereal, and this fabric is perfect for it. And the fabric, honestly, it takes the seam beautifully and iron's gorgeous. So hats off to Minerva, because this is really one of their nicest fabrics. I will be back with my full skirt and top ready to assemble. All right, here we are. We just finished step 7. We sewed all the skirt pieces together. So we have, you know, the right center front, the right side front, the right side back, the center back, the left side back, the left side front, and the left front. So we have this big, beautiful, hoopy skirt, right? And now we're going to take our top, put this aside for a minute. We're going to take our top, and in between the markings, the hash marks on the pattern pieces, we are going to run 2 rows of basting stitches. So that is the longest stitch on your machine. So for the center, this is the back. For the center back, you would run it from here to the other side. And you want to leave long tails on both ends. And we're going to gather these stitches. That's why we use a long basting stitch. And if you use the bobbin thread, it's much easier to gather. And we're going to gather this so it fits the front to the back. So we're going to do each section. I'm just going to do a little bit because I want to see how it's going to fit. But I'm just going to take the threads. And one of the things that you want to think about is matching up the side seams, obviously, and the notches, but also when you stitch these gathering threads, you don't want to stitch them where the seam allowance is. You want to stitch them into the seam allowance and outside the seam where the seam is actually going to go. So inside the seam allowance, then outside the seam allowance, which you can pull out later. Because you don't want to cross these stitches with your regular stitches. That would be difficult to deal with afterwards. Also, you want to make sure you leave tails on both ends and you don't pull too far, because you could pull these other ends right out, and that's not fun either, because then you have to go back and do it again. So now I'm going to lay my skirt with the waistband towards me, right side's facing up, and I'm going to lay my top right sides together against the skirt. Look at that. All right. Now if you don't have I happen to have a crease on my center front, so I'm going to match my center front, my center back to my center back seam. And this is where you want to match up all the notches. Now, you want to have the gathering side down, because the feed dogs will move this and it will help set those gathers into your stitches a little bit better than just having to jam them all in with pinnings. And because you pressed the bodice towards the front and you pressed the seams in the skirt towards the back, they will just butt together. One will go one way and one will go the other, and you can actually like stick them together and feel that they're butting together. And then we're just going to pin them, match the edges. So I'm going to do the side seam, and I'm going to do the front edge. Comes to this little notch here. And I'm just going to coerce my way around the garment. So where there isn't any gathering, it's 1 to 1, right? The fabric is going to go 1 to 1. And then between the, so you want to pin that first. It'll make it a little easier. Then you can see where you have to be. So, and then I have the back here. I'm going to pin this 1 to 1 till I get to where my gathering starts. And now I can see that my gathering is actually almost the same. I want to balance it a little bit. I have a little bit more on one side than the other. So these are gathers. They're not like sleeves where you're trying to ease this in. There's actually going to be little gathers, so you don't have to be super careful about getting little tucks, because that's the expectation, that there will be these little gathering tucks along the way. And look at that. That fits great. And this is where you know, you can make a few adjustments. If you made this top a little bigger and the skirt, or the skirt a little bigger, you know, you have some fiddle room here. So we're going to do the same all the way around, and then I'm going to baste it, because basting it that way I can take the pins out and look at it and make sure it's exactly the way I want it before I go in and put like a 2.5 stitch in there, which is going to be absolutely miserable to tear out. So this says to sew the pieces together, easing the stitches, and then serge and press downwards towards the skirt. So like I said, first thing I'm going to do is pin it, then I'm going to baste it, I'm going to take the pins out, I'm going to make sure I'm happy with the gathering and the way everything looks, then I'll stitch it and serge it and press it. All right, we've sewn this very curvy center seam line that goes just below the midriff, and so our top is attached to our bottom, and it's really starting to look like a dress. I just love this fabric, the way it's floaty, and it's perfect for this kind of soft little retro style shirt dress. So we're going to do the hem. We're going to do a double fold hem. We're going to turn this up 3/8 of an inch, and then turn it up another 3/8 of an inch and stitch it. And what I find the best thing to do for this is to take this to the ironing board and pin it right into my ironing board, measure right and pin right into my ironing board all the way, and press it. And then I can do the second one very easily at that point and put a little stitch in it. Alternatively, you could serge it and just turn it up, or you could, then you would have less thickness, or you could do a baby hem. There's lots of really good alternatives. I think I am going to serge it because I've serged everything else, and I'm just going to turn it up 3/8 of an inch, because I've cut this. It's pretty short now at this point, so I don't want to shorten it too much. So yeah, that's my plan. We're almost done. It's really looking great. Okay, we have our hem done, so let's talk about the hem for just a sec. You want to make sure that the length is correct, but we don't have the shoulder seams sewn yet before you actually do up the hem. So you can pin or stitch baste the shoulder seams together to try this on to make sure that the hem is actually where you want it to be. And I was happy with the length of mine, so I just serged it and turned it over and did a top stitch. So that was pretty simple. The other thing you want to make sure before you finish and move on to the next step is that the fronts, the center fronts, are even. So if I lay out my center front on one side and I lay out my center front on the next side, I'm going to pin, because you want them to fall even right after you put the buttons in. I'm going to pin the hem, and I'm going to pin this little waist section up here, and then I'm just going to make sure, look at that, they're even. I'm happy with that. They're the same length, so when they drape, they're going to drape just fine. And yes, I was really tight on the fabric, so I have a little salvage here. I'm going to trim, that is a little bumpy. I'm going to trim a little bit of that off before I add this on. So the next thing is the button stands and the buttonhole stands. And I serge to the edge. It talks about turning the edge over, and the edge, you are going to stitch this with the machine or by hand, but I serged it because I just wanted it nice and clean. And then you fold it under 1/4 of an inch, so I just folded it under the serge portion, but I wanted to make sure that they were balanced, and that's the most important thing. When everything is said and done, you want to be able to make sure that they are the same width. You don't want like one section of your button stand to be 1 1/4 inches, and then the next section to be 3/8 of an inch, and then the next section to be 1.5 inches. This needs to be the same width all the way up. So in order to make this button stand, I am going to put right sides together. And this is that fold that I folded up where I serged, and I'm going to stitch across the bottom. This is the flange that's going to get sewed to my raw edge of the front of my dress. And I'm just going to fold this under, and see that nice little sharp corner there? I want that sharp corner on the outside, right? And then press this in half all the way down. So here's my beautiful button stand all ready to go. So I have one for each side. So we're going to pin those on and put our buttons on. All right, so here I have the right front of my dress, and I have my button stand with the finished edge at the bottom, and I'm going to line that finished edge up here with my hem, right, to make sure that they match up perfectly. I know that the pattern says to start at the top, but if you've miscut at all, this isn't going to match. So it's important that this matches. And we're going to pin this open edge all the way down the front, all the way up to the shoulder. All right, and what's going to happen when you stitch this, all right, as you stitch this, this will all turn over, and you're going to have this pretty little placket. And on this side, you're going to encase the seam with this turned under serged edge, so everything will be all pretty on the inside. So I'm going to pin both of my plackets down and stitch them at 3/8 of an inch and turn them and get them all set to go. And we'll be back to talk about, buttons and buttonholes. Here we are. I have this one facing side completely finished. It looks gorgeous all the way up. You know, we have this really nice anchor at the bottom where it meets, and I have stitched this by hand on the inside. Now, the directions say to machine stitch in the ditch here, and you can certainly do that, but what happens in the back is you get this kind of lump in the back, and I wanted to avoid that. I wanted something a little bit more elegant. This fabric is super soft and floaty. So what we do to find the one that isn't stitched here, there we go. So here is my unstitched button facing. I have sewn it to my garment and then serged it and then made sure it's nice and pressed, and I want to make sure that I measure this. You want to keep this at 7/8 of an inch all the way down. It's important that if you look at this one, how even that looks, right? It's the same from top to bottom. We don't have wobbles. So we're going to press the seam allowance towards the button casing and fold under that raw edge, serged edge, right? And just pin it. And I'm going to do that all the way down, all the while measuring this front piece to make sure that it's 7/8 of an inch. That's the most important thing. Then I'm just going to hand stitch this to the seam allowance so you don't see any stitches on the front. It's all hand stitched and encased on the back. So I'll go back and do that other side, but for now we're going to move on, and the next step is the shoulders. So my facing is a little long. I wasn't sure how long I was going to hem this, so I made sure that I cut it and I had plenty of extra just in case. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pin up the shoulder seams, right? So I have this is the front and this is the back, and I'm going to pin them right sides together, matching them at the armhole. And you come into this juncture at the neck edge with a seam allowance width apart from the edge of the neck, right? You have this, you're not quite all the way to the neck edge, because the next thing that's going to happen is we're going to apply our facing. So we're going to kind of do this all at once. I've serged the big curved edge of my facing, and the facing gets pinned on this way over the shoulder seam all the way across. I'm not going to do the other side because I haven't finished my facing yet. And this gets actually stitched in to this, so it gets all stitched in together. Now I'm going to stitch from the armhole to the neck edge, and I'm going to stitch off. I don't like to pivot, because when you pivot, if your needle doesn't go all the way down and engage with the bobbin, you're going to get a skip stitch and you'll never get a really pretty corner. So I'm going to go all the way off, then I'm going to come back on right here where this juncture is, where the button casing, right, meets everything, and go back around this way and sew off, and then sew my other shoulder. And then when that's finished, I'll be able to turn it all around, and I'll have this beautiful, completely finished neck edge that will look great. So I'm going to go back and finish this facing, this button facing, and sew my shoulders and my back neck facing down. And yeah, we're on to sleeves, I believe, after that. That's pretty exciting. We're almost finished. Okay, so we pinned our facing and our sleeves, stitched them, and serged them. I checked them before I serged them, turned them inside right to make sure that they were the way I wanted. But I want to talk to you about trimming. You know, people that know me know I'm not a big fan of facings because they pop out a lot. But since these facings are sewn right into the shoulder seam, they're going to stay really well. So I'm happy with this. And then it's really hard to get a nice flat crease on a curved seam. So we're just going to snip a few little, this fabric is a little delicate and I don't want to have too many snips in there, but just enough to kind of release that a little bit and give it some, release some of the tension. So then we're just going to turn it around. Obviously the facing needs to be pressed, as does the shoulder seams. But what we end up with is this gorgeous front, right, with this facing. So once that's pressed down in there, it will be fabulous, and our front and shoulder seams are all done. They also need a good pressing, but they look great. I'm really happy with this, and of course this is, at this point I tried it on and I love the way it fits, and this fabric is just to die for this type of a dress. So now we're going to do sleeves, and we're just simply going to sew the sleeves together along the inside sleeve and press them, you know, like everything else, we press it flat, and then we're going to press the seam to one side, and then we're going to make the casing for the elastic. So take your little, I use a small sleeve pressing board, and pinned this up 3/4 of an inch and pressed it, and then turned the rest of it up 3 inches and pressed it. And this is going to make that little flounce that is below the sleeve. So the sleeve, go back to our original drawing here. We're almost at the end of our construction process here. So this sleeve has this little tiny flounce. Now, I have to tell you, I'm a little skeptical. I don't know that I will make it that flouncy. We'll see. If I don't like the flounce, it's easy enough to take the elastic out and turn it into a cuff. So we're gonna do that, but we're gonna go and do the flounce and see how it looks. So now I have my edge folded in and my 3 inches folded up. I'm going to stitch up here near the edge, and I'm going to leave a little opening so I can put the elastic in through there, and then I'm going to stitch 3/8 of an inch down below. So I need to check to make sure my elastic is what that I have here on hand is what they have, because the elastic needs to slide through there. So they are asking for 1/4 inch elastic. So let's go see if we have some 1/4 inch elastic. So this requires 1/4 inch elastic, and I don't know that I actually have. Here's my elastic bin, and I'm looking to see. I don't think I have 1/4 inch. This is 3/8 inch. 1/4 inch is pretty thin. I have this cording, and that may be what I'm going to end up using, because that's about 1/8 of an inch. This is too big. So I'm going to use this cording because that's what I have on hand. So 3/8 of an inch will be more than enough, because I'm going to feed this cording in through the opening. So I'm going to stitch around here right at the edge, leaving a little bit of an opening, and then I'm going to stitch below that to close in a place to put the elastic. So I'm going to go do that on both of these shirts, and then we'll thread shirts. I'm going to do that on both of these sleeves, and then we will come back and thread up the elastic and put the sleeves into the dress. And then we're down to buttons and buttonholes, the real scary part. Ooh. So the instructions called for a 22-inch piece of elastic, and then you would cut that in half, and there's 11 inches for each sleeve. I made mine 24 because my size is a little larger than the smaller size, and I don't want it super puffy. So this is a 12-inch piece of elastic, and I've attached a safety pin to it. It's really the only way to do this. If you had a bodkin, you could probably do it. So you have this first opening here, and you're just going to slide your safety pin in and push the safety pin through that casing, that little casing, right? Take this other end and pin it to your fabric, because as you pull through, you don't want to pull this all the way through to the other end. That would be miserable. So once you get your pin all the way through that casing, the flounce isn't super flouncy. That extra inch, I think, makes a big difference. So it helps a little bit, and I end up with my pinned piece here. This is my little tail that's pinned. Just barely see it. And then this is my safety pin. And I'm going to join these two together. Now, if you had flat elastic, it would be easy enough to join them with a step zigzag stitch on your machine. I'm going to tie a little knot, and then I'm going to run the machine through it because it is so super skinny, little super skinny elastic. Once we've done that, we're going to go back and sew up that little opening that we left to thread the elastic through. So once you're happy with that, and you may want to wait until after you try the dress on to make sure that the elastic isn't too tight or too loose to tie up that little bit, because if it's too tight, you can unthread it without having to rip out stitches and put a larger piece of elastic in. And if it's too loose, you can do the same thing. You can just make it smaller and then go back and finish that off. So the next thing we're going to do after we do that is between the notches, we're going to do 2 rows of basting stitches because we need to gather this up. So you've done that before if you've put in sleeves. So you're going to do one that's within inside the 3/8 inch seam allowance and one that is outside the 3/8 inch seam allowance. I did want to mention one thing. I think when I was talking about turning this edge over, I mentioned that it was 3/4 of an inch. It's not, it's 3/8. So you turn this 3/8 and then you turn the whole thing 3. So I'm going to go finish up with my elastic, get my basting stitches all set, and then we're going to put our sleeves in. All right, we have our beautiful finished shoulder seams and buttons and facing for the back neckline. And one of the things that they don't mention in the instructions that I always like to do is understitch. So what I'm going to do, it'll help keep the facing in place. So what I'm going to do is along the back, I'll do it on this side, I'm going to stitch the facing to the seam allowance. So what'll happen is there'll be a stitch right here, right along the edge of the facing, and it will help turn this facing in, and you won't see it on the outside of the garment, something structural on the inside. It doesn't take that long. And because of the way this is stitched, you're not going to get all the way into these corners, but I'm going to go as far as I can. Any bit of understitching that I put there will make a difference in keeping the facing in place. So I'm going to attach my sleeve. And one of the things that you want to keep in mind with a sleeve is that you need to know where the top notch is, and they're not always symmetrical, right? That is not in the middle of the top of the sleeve. So you need to know where that notch is because that lines up to your shoulder seam. You also need to know where the double notch is because that indicates the back of the garment. And the shape of this pattern is different. It's shallower in the front than it is in the back because we need more fullness in our sleeves in the back. So here's my sleeve. I've added the elastic flounce, and this is the pin for the center that attaches to the shoulder seam, and this is the pin. I put one pin in where the double notch is in the back, so I know that that's the back of the garment. So I know this sleeve is going to go on this side of the garment, right? Everything is laid up front the way it's going to look when it's completed. So this sleeve will attach to this part, this side of the garment, and I want to match up this pin, this top pin, with my shoulder seam. The other thing that I want to do is I want to pin it from the dress side because we have all that gathering and we want the feed dogs to help us with that. So I'm going to turn my shoulder over and grab the pin and just anchor this pin right sides together with the top of my sleeve to the shoulder seam, just so I know it's there. Now I can start to manipulate this and move it around, and I know that it's actually going to be in the right place. So I'm going to pin it from the dress side. So now my shoulder is pinned. I'm going to go to the underarm. And I have one seam going one way and one seam going the other way, so I can butt the underarm together. Pin that. Then underneath the sleeve where we don't have that gathering stitch, that's 1 to 1. So I'm going to pin that too. Just get that out of the way because I know that the fabric is going to be 1 to 1. We don't need any gathering underneath our arms. So what I have left are the convex and the concave seams I have to match up together. So I have, this section of the sleeve, of the armhole, and this section of the sleeve. And that's where these threads come into play. I'm going to pull the basting threads like we did for the gathering, for the bust, just enough so that this section fits the other section. Sleeve. I've gone in and pinned it, and quite frankly, it didn't need a whole lot of gathering. I did have to move that notch piece up at the top a little bit because there wasn't enough fabric on the armhole for the sleeve in the front, and there was way too much in the back. But by the time I finished repinning it, there was hardly any gathering at all. So I'm going to put the other one in. It should be easy peasy. I am going to try it on just to make sure that I'm happy the way the sleeves fall after I baste them in because I did move them around a little bit. And I haven't put the buttons on yet because I tried it on and I need to make a few edits. While I love this fabric, this pattern it looks like I'm wearing an old robe. Just doesn't suit my body very well. So there's a couple of things that I need to do. First of all, the gathering for the bust is way over here. The pattern when it's drafted, when you move to a larger size, the gathering moves all the way out to over here. So the notch is way over here. Well, you know what? I don't need gathering over in this space, which is all of this right here. So when I put it on, and you can see the picture, I have all of this extra fabric here, which is not flattering at all. And the gathering actually starts, because it's moved so far, starts here instead of here, which is where you need it, like right under the bust, right? So it's actually over on this side. So that's the first problem. The second problem is it's too long from here to here for me, because this is where the first button is going to go, and I want this really nice V that we put in to come under the bust. I'm going to, thankfully we have all this extra fabric, I'm going to cut this off, open it up, and shorten it a little bit, and move the gatherings over here on each side of the bust, and make this nice and smooth. And then I'm probably going to have to take this in maybe an inch and a half all the way around. The armholes are okay, and the girth around the bust area is fine, so I'm not going to take it in here. I'm just going to start and make a dart and make it skinnier all the way down. The next issue is these sleeves. They look heavy for this really lightweight dress, and then all of a sudden you have these sleeves that are doubled, and they're just too heavy. So the first thing I'm going to do is take the elastic out, because, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that it already seemed like the elastic was going to be a real issue for me, but I wanted to try it and see how it looked. And for me, that already looks 100% better. But I think what I'm going to do is shorten the sleeves, because I want this to be kind of light and airy, right? So that's the goal, that the dress is light and spring-like and summery and airy and all of those wonderful things. So I'm going to shorten this up, the sleeve up, and that already lightens up some of the top of it. And then fix, again, like I said, fix these gathers over here at the side. These doing nothing for me, and there's no gathers right here underneath the bust line, which is ridiculous. So these will all move. I'm going to open this up. So for editing purposes for this line here, I'm not going to change the structure of the button tab. This is fine. This center front, all of this right here within the first 4 inches, 2 or 3 inches on either side is great. It's this part from here to here. So I'm going to open this up, and because the whole dress is way too long in the top part anyway, I'm going to be able to just cut this seam out all the way around except from here to here. I'm going to leave that attached so I don't have to change any of this. I'm going to put the gathering in this spot, make this smooth, and then sew the seam back and end up shortening this by about 1 inch in the process. And that will bring this blouse up to where the bust line is, which will make it much more feminine and less granny-like. And then maybe perhaps take the sides in. We'll see after I do all of those if I need to take the sides in a little bit. So that will make that a much better dress, and the next rendition of this will look very different on me. So stay tuned. All right, here we are back with our really pretty Taika blouse dress. We shortened the sleeves, right? We took the ruffle off, which I'm sure is adorable for somebody. It was just a little too much for me. And I actually cut this bodice part apart and resewed it together at about 1 inch, making a dart starting here and then going all the way around and ending up back here. So that solved an awful lot of problems. I changed the gathering and there's very little gathering, to right underneath the bust line, which helped tremendously. But because this is cut on such a large curve, there's this extra, like right here, this kind of extra lump of fabric, and it has to do with the way the cut is made. So what I've done is I'm going to put just a little tuck here on the side, and you can see that this side bulges out a little bit and this side is nice and straight. And you'll notice it more when it's on, because as soon as I put it on, I feel like I'm wearing a house dress that doesn't quite fit. And you know, since I grew up in the 60s, I remember house dresses, you might not. but it just takes it in a little bit. I mean, I could have gone back and taken it in on the side seams, but this is where the problem is. So I'm just going to put a little tuck in there and it'll be perfectly wearable. I'm just going to stitch it right along the seam line there. So it's just a little, like a little pleat, and it'll just take care of that. It's like a bump, and it's because of the way it's cut. So no problem there. Okay, let's talk about buttons, because when you make something with buttons going down the front to close up the garment, you want to make sure that you have your first button in the right place. A lot of patterns come with a button strip. You know, everybody's body's different, so we want to make sure that we have the critical button fixed, right? This is where we need to know where the critical button goes, right? This is the place that we need to start. So right along the bust line here, this is where you want your blouse, shirt, dress closed. All right, you need to have this button here because this is where the gapping is going to occur. We don't want gapping right there at the bust line. Now from there you can determine how many buttons you want going down and space them. But if you don't start with this, you're not going to be happy, because this is where the gapping is going to occur when you move, and you don't want that, right? So if your button pattern piece, you like the spacing of that, that's fine. Shift it up and down so that it lands right on this critical button point. Don't just take their word for it. It's a simple thing. Also, you can just simply start with that critical button and then decide where you want the rest of your buttons to go, and just space them evenly all the way down in the blouse dress. But this is the most important piece right here to make sure that your dress fits correctly. It's pretty simple. You can use one of those button expandable button tools. I just use a ruler and mark them off, but I always start from here and then go up and down. This one, you obviously, with this dress you wouldn't go up, but if it's a shirt and you have a button here up at the stay, then you're going to want to make the spaces between the critical button and the stay, figure out what that middle space is, and then the rest of the buttons would go along with that space if you're going to wear it buttoned up. Certainly there's lots of different ways I typically just lay mine down and I lay the buttons out and do something visual, but I always mark this button. Make sure this is where you start. That's the critical button, and that's the best way to get a blouse to button perfectly so you don't have any gapping. All right, so we're gonna go put the buttons on this dress and buttonholes, and then this dress is done and I'm really happy with it, so I can't wait to show you finished.